First of all, thank you for your time, and I'm really honored to start this actually research. You opened the research because it's my first interview in this series, and I'm really happy and grateful. And I know you have tremendous experience in this field. And Institute for the Study of Peak States discovered like more than 50 states of transcendence of the peak states.
Mm-hmm.
What resonates personally with me is that it's not some kind of moments that we experience, but actually it's our natural uh, birthright, natural ability, and
Exactly.
we can experience it for prolonged times. So
Mm-hmm.
that really fascinates me, and I think these states fascinate people for many, for 1,000 years, like from the sages of their
Exactly. Yeah.
past till modern scientists, and nobody still didn't get it to the end.
Mm-hmm.
So we're still all in the process. And I'm also like at the beginning, and this is my personal calling and professional one. So I'm really, really happy to make this discussion with you. And let's begin. I'm open for everything, really.
Okay. Great. Great.
So, first, can you tell a little bit more about your background, your professional background, and background with this kind of states?
Yeah. In this particular work, I'm the CEO of a global organization called the Institute for the Study of Peak States. So I was trained in those techniques about 15 years ago, but the Institute was established in the late 90s. So our founder, Dr. Grant McFedridge, has been studying consciousness for over 30 years. And within the Institute, not only am I the CEO, I'm also the Director of Training, and I'm one of the 3 global trainers that trains people in our peak states therapy techniques. We have another trainer who also trains in our trauma therapy techniques as well.
You started it in this institute, or it was something before? Like, what took you to this kind of
Yeah,
topic?
so for me, it was a lot of people who come to our organisation have generally either experienced some kind of had a peak experience, and that kind of piques their interest to kind of understand a little bit more around what is that, and when they type in peak states or peak experience, they'll quite often get to our website or come across one of Grant's books. But for me, it was more a case of I was more fortunate that I was actually born with some good peak states, which, as you were saying at the start, all of us are meant to be born with these peak states. And so there was some of them that I was born with that maybe aren't that common. I don't know exactly which states they were, but I definitely seem to experience life differently to others. So in my corporate career before I came to the Institute, I was working in consulting and kind of went into organizational culture and leadership development work. And so I was coaching executives and helping people improve their leadership skills. And I was just amazed that, more than 95% of the people were talking about having this negative self-talk and all of this inner turmoil that was going on in their lives that was not occurring for me. So for me, it was more around, I wanted to understand, why is it that other people have got this internal suffering going on all the time, and how can I actually help them more effectively? So that's kind of what started my journey. So lots of people in my life, personally close to me, as far as family members, have gone through lots of different types of trauma. I had a university colleague who attempted suicide. So there was plenty of people around me that were going through really tough times, and I was doing the best that I could to support them, but I knew I needed to understand more to be able to really effectively help them. And so when I came across, I did lots of things. I studied NLP and I studied hypnosis. And in the NLP course, someone asked me, would you like to come across to an information session around peak states of consciousness? Now, this was 15 years ago, and I didn't even really know what that meant at the time, but there was something about that just lit up my neurology, that I felt like this is something that I need to understand. And when the woman who was making the presentation at the time started to explain their explanation as to why people have peak states. It's like, this is the first time I feel like someone's really understanding what's actually going on. So I've signed up for the next training, and and Grant, the founder, was one of the trainers there. We established a really good relationship, and pretty much after I got certified, he was saying, one day I want you to be CEO, given my business background.
I want to make it a little bit more close to people, like that they will understand, because what happened to me, I experienced these states, but to some certain age, I was a little bit crazy because I didn't know nothing about it, actually. Then I discovered it's some kind of normal. It was kind of relief for me because I didn't know. So my also purpose is to explain it to people in some easy ways that we can. So, and actually I think this is the most maybe profound question, and to start with, so what you consider transcendent state, transcendent peak state, altered state? There is no even one name, and you
Exactly.
the names of it. So let's try to just to touch a little bit this phenomena. I know that it's impossible to grasp it fully, but at least like what you understand, what it is.
Yeah. So the reason, so we believe Grant was the person who coined the state peak state. And so the reason he called it a peak state was, building on what Abraham Maslow was talking about. He talked about peak experiences, right? So people are more familiar with peak experiences around these moments that could be for minutes or hours or days or weeks, but not permanent, where you just have this positive experience, whether it's a positive emotion, a positive sensation that is beyond what you would normally experience day to day, right? And sometimes it's just really simple things. It's like just being in nature, looking at a flower, looking into the eyes of someone that you really care about for periods of time, and all of a sudden you're feeling this immense joy, or this unconditional love, or underlying happiness, right? And so he talked about peak experiences. In the 90s, when Grant started his journey, no one was talking about peak states. Like, people talk about it quite a bit now, but in the 90s, no one was talking about it. So because he knew it was possible to have it permanently, well, he said, well, it's like a peak experience, but it's a permanent state. And so that's where he actually then coined the term peak state. So, and when he first started the journey, he figured people had already figured that out, how to get a peak state. So he studied Buddhism, and he talked to lots of spiritual teachers and trauma developers and that sort of stuff, and asking them the questions around, what is the peak state that you're trying to get people to achieve, and how do you actually achieve it? What's the reason for that? And most people had some kind of practice that someone did that got them into a peak state, and now they're teaching them the same practice, but they didn't have a good understanding around why that happened. They just know that it happened. And the other thing that was interesting was when you then asked them, what are the characteristics? How would you describe what this peak state is like, the lived experience? Everyone was describing something different. Whereas the language that people tend to use when they talk about peak states is like there's this one nirvana state, this one state of transcendence that we're all trying to get to, where that's not actually the case. As you mentioned, Grant has heard of or experienced about 100 different peak states and has documented about 50 of them. And they're all got different qualities. Some of them are, the qualities are around a particular positive emotion that you always have. Even when you kind of get triggered, this underlying positive quality is there all the time, or it becomes your new default. Or you have this experience of like being one with the universe, or you have peak abilities that are not very common amongst humanity, but are very real. So this is how he's then started to describe what different peak states are like, more by their specific qualities, which are positive in nature. Now, he didn't know at the time, but as he tried to discover what's actually going on, the model that he's developed says that what we're experiencing in these peak states is an optimally biological process. So the reason we feel really positive, or the reason we all of a sudden have a peak ability, is because biologically we're operating the way that we're meant to, and most of us are not. And this is where trauma healing becomes important, because if you then are able to understand what kinds of trauma and have effective trauma healing techniques, you can actually heal the traumas that are then blocking you from having that naturally.
Mm-hmm. So these states are related to our physical level, like the cellular level.
Yeah, and this is probably outside of the normal paradigm, because most people separate kind of our physical manifestation from a spiritual kind of experience, and they see them as two different things. Our model says that, and so Grant wrote about this in his second book on Peak States of Consciousness, Volume 2, which was specifically dedicated to explain spiritual and shamanic states, that he wrote with Wes Geetz. And what's actually happening is that there's stuff going on within, it's actually one particular cell. So our model says our consciousness actually resides in one single cell that Grant's called the primary cell. Mm-hmm. And what's happening within that cell, the state of that particular cell, the health of that cell, determines how we feel as far as the peak states that we have, but it also explains why we have certain spiritual and shamanic experiences. So things that feel like they're non-material, but feel like we hear voices, or we see images of spirits or other things, can actually be explained by this particular model.
And we can affect by affecting our psychic, we can affect our physical state.
Correct. You can use simple but effective trauma healing techniques to then improve the state of the primary cell, which will then change permanently the experience that you're having. Either permanently get you into a peak state, or permanently eliminate the kind of negative experience you might have been having.
Now in our bodies, or
yes.
It is the concept of this primary cell that was one day, or it's
no,
now?
It's actually in our body. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it got created just after conception, and it stays with us our entire life. So unlike all other cells in the body where, the cells die off and then new ones get created, this one cell stays with us our entire life. And so just to kind of briefly touch on how this explains spiritual and shamanic experiences, where we're experiencing things that feel like they're in another realm, like outside of our body. They're not physical, we can't touch them, but we can definitely see or hear them. That's basically something that's happening in the primary cell that's being superimposed onto our physical body and surroundings.
What does it mean?
So this is a transpersonal biology explanation. So there's something happening on in the cell, and I guess it's a little bit like a holographic universe. What's happening in the cell is then kind of like a hologram into our physical universe, and so we're experiencing things that might look or sound like spirits, or other things that we might be seeing or hearing are actually a reflection of what's happening in the primary cell.
Do I understand correctly that it's only about positive emotions, or there is something else there?
Well, not necessarily positive emotions, but positive experiences. So either positive emotions, positive sensations. So for example, spiritually, people would say, a very high state of consciousness, it would be to realize that we are actually effectively connected to all living things, right? And people kind of might get that conceptually, but it's a whole different thing to actually have that as a lived experience, that you really are connected as one. So that's not necessarily a positive emotion, but it's definitely a positive experience. What would be other ones? Other ones initially may not feel like they're positive, but they actually are the result of positive biology. So some states feel like your body feels hollow inside, or you feel like you don't have any skin boundary anymore. So again, they're physical experiences of a particular state that are, that in our model would be peak states, but not just around emotions.
It's becoming a very trendy topic, and people, I think there is this chance of some misleading. So can you, I don't know, for example, today I heard the interview, for example, that people say that they feel transcendent during the war, that people unite, or you can feel transcendent, I don't know, being in religious trance and like to some following some dogma. Is it transcendent states? Where is this boundaries, or like have you? What about?
Yeah, well, see, this is where I guess in our model, the thing that would definitely make it a peak state in our model is that it is optimally biologically optimal. So, for example, a spiritual state that some people might try and achieve would be samadhi. Now, samadhi would be a state where your IQ is incredibly high. You hardly need to breathe at all. It's like your body consciousness hardly needs any living at all. Now, Grant, in his research phases, did some crazy things to actually experience different things that people are talking about. So he actually worked out how to get this state of samadhi. But in our model, it actually wouldn't be called a peak state. And that's because what he discovered was the way to actually experience this was to shut down the heart consciousness and shut down the body consciousness so that you then only live through the mind consciousness, which would explain why you have this IQ that kind of goes through the roof. So he was teaching at university at the time, and he's an incredibly intelligent person, but he said, books that I had to work hard to understand all of a sudden were just really easy to understand. But in our model, we wouldn't really call that a peak state. We probably still have it listed on the website as a peak state, but technically we probably wouldn't say that is a peak state, because shutting down part of our consciousness so that, we don't have the full functionality of our heart consciousness, so we can't really feel emotions and emotionally connect to others, or we're shutting down our body consciousness so we can't effectively feel physical sensations. To us, that's not really a peak state.
So it's something integral. You should all the systems are involved in peak states.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's interesting because I'm also like the fan of yoga, and about samadhi, they told about this, that the yogi just had to fulfill this samadhi, they had to move out from society. And some yogis chose this path, but some decided to come back. This like the tantric tradition, they said, okay, but we want to still experience, if we're here, we want to experience this bliss inside life. So this is something about like not going away totally, but being here in this state. Yeah.
And there are some things in the cell that are unhealthy that'll have us believe like they're a peak state. So, for example, this feeling of a creator state, where like you're connected in a numinous way, godlike type of way, that feeling like you've got this ability to be a creator. Now, there are things that in the cell that can actually make you feel that way, but it's actually not a positive thing. So this is where it gets really tricky to actually determine, is someone really in a peak state, or are they almost being fooled by their unhealthy biology that they're actually in a peak state? So it's not easy to describe just from characteristics of how they're experiencing. You really need to understand what's happening at a biology level.
And by the way, for example, why the creator state is not a peak state?
Oh no, creator state is a peak state.
Is a peak state.
But if you looked at the qualities of that, some people experience very similar qualities that actually are not the creator state. So that's why it gets tricky to define exactly what a peak state is. And so that's a bit similar to some of the examples you were giving, where people are saying, oh, I felt transcendent because I was in this kind of environment where I felt, this belonging to everyone else, but the belonging is probably more trauma driven in some way, as opposed to an optimal connection with others.
And for you, this distinguishing criteria that it's a peak state, this is this optimal biological state, or something else?
I think that's probably the best example from our model. Yeah, best definition from our model.
But how can we, like without MRIs and, all the machines, how can we know it if we are like biologically optimal?
So there's two ways that we actually help people when it comes to peak states. So we focus all over work on peak states. We don't focus on just having peak experiences. So the two types of clients that will come along wanting to do peak states therapy with us. One is they've actually had a peak experience. It was amazing for them. And they want to now work out how to have that as a permanent state. So we've got a protocol that takes them through identifying different types of traumas that are blocking them from having that permanently. Because our explanation for why people have a peak experience is that temporarily the trauma or traumas that were blocking you from having that permanently were switched off. So that's why things like going into nature, lovemaking, looking into the eyes of someone you love, that they're these kind of experiences that have you in a very connected state. Can even intense exercise or exercise for long periods of time where you kind of get in the zone. Traumas that are blocking you from having peak states can temporarily get switched off, and that's when you then experience the state that you're meant to have. But it only lasts for a certain amount of time because something happens and then that trauma gets triggered again, and so then it blocks you from having it as a peak state. So we've got a protocol we can go through to identify what types of traumas are blocking you, and then depending on what type of trauma it is, how to heal those traumas so you then will get it as a permanent state. So that's one kind of group. The approach that we were initially targeting, because Grant's first discovery was that it was prenatal trauma that was blocking us, was to regress back to the prenatal moment that we call a key developmental event, and identify what that event is. Now, the good thing about it is it's the same event for everyone. So then once you identify what that key developmental event is, that prenatal trauma that needs to be that key prenatal event that needs to be trauma-free for you to have the corresponding peak state, once you identify that, you then regress back to it, you heal all the trauma that happened in that moment, and now you actually have that peak state permanently. So that was the approach that we started with, and it's still the approach we use for things like Inner Peace and Silent Mind. But we moved away from it because we started to have this kind of menu of states that you could choose from, and people were going, "Oh, that sounds like the state that I'm looking for," based on a peak experience. Now they would get the state that the menu said they were going to get, and they were like, "I'm still not quite happy that that's what I was looking for. It's not what I thought it was," and that's because they had a different peak experience to the state that we're actually, and so that's why we actually probably tend to do more peak experience to peak state kind of work now rather than peak states from a menu. One of the first things that Grant discovered around peak states, which was quite different to what most people believed, was that the thing that blocks us from having peak states as our natural birthright is prenatal trauma. Most people are asking, what do you need to do to get peak states? So that's why you have lots of spiritual practices and leading a virtuous life and all these other things around doing it. But for him, that didn't make any sense because he had a peak state from his first year of birth until he was 29 when he lost a really amazing peak state that he discovered Native Americans call Beauty Way or Walking in Beauty. And that's what changed his life. He was trained as an engineer at Stanford and then was teaching engineering at university and was a successful engineering consultant. But when he lost that state, he decided he wanted to figure out how to get that back, and getting it back would then mean he'd probably be able to work out how to give it to other people as well. So that's what started his journey. And so in discovering that, and so he was asking the question, rather than what do you need to do to get it, maybe the question is what's actually blocking us from actually having it? And that's where he kind of came across that was actually prenatal trauma that was blocking us from having peak state. One of the most common types of trauma that blocks us is generational trauma. So what trauma did we inherit that blocks us from having the peak states, which explains why lots of people don't have peak states, because it's because of generational trauma that's been inherited that's blocking us from having it. So once you discover that key developmental event, you can then start healing those. So yeah, theoretically, it is possible to heal all the trauma that's blocking us so that we have all of the peak states.
Mm-hmm. And these generation traumas, because there are certain directions like regressions and this generation therapy that you can go up to 7, 8, 100 generations ahead. Yeah. So how you get to this?
Yeah. So in our model, so we've heard of some models that say, you only need to go back 7 generations. Our model says you just go back to whenever the generational trauma started. So that might be just 2 or 3 generations, and sometimes it might be, 20, 30, maybe 100 generations. Some people have said, I've definitely gone back to medieval times or, very, very early times in history to when the generational trauma actually first existed. So we've got an approach for how you actually heal those. So there's 2 or 3 different ways that you can heal those.
And should a person believe in this concept of, for example, passing these states through generations or past lives, or he can be absolutely I don't know, normal? I would say not believing in some kind of things, or he has to be open to this concept.
So I don't know if I've got a good example from a peak states perspective, but if I just talk about generally around generational trauma, in the trainings that I do, we first teach people our model and our trauma healing techniques, and they have to become certified trauma therapists before we then teach them peak states therapy, because the trauma, you need to know the trauma healing techniques first. And so we do practice clients in our trauma healing, and we had one of the students brought along her husband who was very skeptical about this work. He's having anger issues in his life, and he's angry with a neighbor, he's angry with people at work, he's angry with his family. And so the student therapist was kind of just using simple trauma healing techniques to heal the anger. So he was very skeptical. I'm here because my wife told me to come along, sort of stuff, using these simple trauma healing techniques. And it made a huge difference to him. He says, doesn't make any sense to me that doing this simple technique, how can this be getting rid of my anger? But we followed up with him weeks later, and it really did make a difference. So you don't necessarily, now it is possible sometimes that limiting beliefs will get in the road, can cause a barrier, but it's not like you have to be really open to this for it to work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the main, you discovered that the main reason is generation traumas. What else blocks us from experiencing it naturally?
Yeah, so they're all, in our model, they're going to be all different types of traumas. So prenatal trauma, which we call biographical trauma, so a trauma that's happened sometime in your life. So our model of consciousness is that our consciousness starts when our parents are actually being implanted in the womb of their mother. So our consciousness starts inside our 2 grandmothers. So the very first parts of our consciousness that then go on to become what we define as consciousness being formed in those early stages. So anywhere from that moment when you're inside your grandmother through to being born can be a key developmental event that's got trauma. So having an effective prenatal trauma regression technique to be able to heal that trauma can also, is a very effective way of actually healing the trauma that blocks us from having peak states. Another thing that's, if someone's had a peak experience, even though this cognitively doesn't make sense, some people freak out when all of a sudden they feel really positive. It's like the body consciousness says, it's not safe for me to feel that joyful all the time, or And so there's a technique that we call body associations that's healing those illogical associations that the body consciousness has that says, if I feel that way, it's like I'm going to die. And it's kind of breaking those illogical associations. So that's another type of trauma that can block us as well.
Mm-hmm. But for me, for example, when we deal with traumas, it's all the time this period of releasing that is not easy, in all this trauma therapies, some things we have to face, and these moments are quite, in many cases, they are painful after you release, but it can be really the crisis or like the crash of your world, actually, yeah? So is it happened, you also have to pass through something, this negative experience to experience this or no?
Well, this is where
trauma, yeah.
Yeah, this is where it's important. This is where it really helps that we have a model that explains what we believe is happening, because then when we're doing trauma healing techniques, we have a very clear indication as to whether that trauma has been released. So because our model says this is a biological model that's explaining peak states, then we're working on how do we release those, the symptoms of that trauma, the emotions, the physical sensations that are actually there in the body in a very quick way. So, for example, a stuck emotion that's in the primary cell that we're releasing, and the techniques that we use only take a minute or two to release. So yes, they might be intense for a short period of time, but you use our techniques that can be released as quick as 1 or 2 minutes. Now, other techniques can take longer than that, but still we're talking about minutes, which is very different to a lot of approaches. A lot of therapies are more cognitively trying to understand or cognitively trying to work out how to more effectively respond to them, but not actually eliminate them. Whereas our trauma healing techniques are actually releasing it permanently from the body so that trauma is not there anymore.
So what happens actually in our bodies, in our minds, in our all the levels when you're releasing and when you're experiencing the
Yeah, so it depends on what the state is as to what's happening. So for example, we have a peak state that we call silent mind. So just about everyone experiences kind of mind chatter, the monkey mind, the constant thoughts and voices, the inner critic and that sort of stuff. So the peak state of silent mind permanently eliminates that, doesn't have that. So most people who are trying to get rid of that are using meditation over many years to try and have those thoughts and voices disappear. Whereas at the moment, our process takes a few hours, but we're working on a new process at the moment that'll probably do it in under an hour to permanently eliminate those voices. So that's an example of how the mind can change. We already talked a fair bit around
what happens, for example, because now they explain that there are certain, neuropaths and they like being established for many years, and to break this connection, you have to, again, to spend many years like disconnecting this path. So what is your view of how it's happening, how you can break these patterns?
So this is where it depends on whether the model you've got to explain what's happening is actually correct or not. So in our model, it's actually a fungal infection within the primary cell that's actually the underlying mechanism for those thoughts. So those thoughts are not meant to be there. They're actually trauma-based. And so our technique actually gets rid of that infection, so the primary cell becomes healthier, and so we then no longer have those kind of dysfunctional thoughts and voices. From an emotion perspective, we've already talked quite a bit around the different emotional reactions you might have. A number of the states that Grant has named are based on what's the emotional content. So you have this sense of happiness all the time is called underlying happiness. You have the sense of joy all the time. So that's the joy state. So some states will have a particular emotion to them that will then be your normal way of being, that you'll always have that sense of love, joy, happiness, whatever it is, peace, will always be there. Even when you kind of get upset, it's still there in the background, and it becomes your default way of being once you're kind of out of the upset.
And you can consciously choose what state, because you say that these layers are present in us, all of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Joy, bliss, and I don't know, solar-minded. Yeah, like when the mind is still. So how it's working? Okay, we release the traumas, but there are so many layers, and it just spontaneously appears one of them, or we choose which state we are, or it's
No,
like
once you have the peak state, it's there all the time. So you can be feeling multiple emotions there all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then from a physical sensation, I mentioned a couple before that you might have around kind of feeling hollow or no skin, feeling connected to all living things. One's around, it feels like the external world feels like it's actually inside your body. So there's different types of physical experiences that you can have as well.
Mm-hmm.
Which again, for some people, they can have a reaction to, and so you then need to help them integrate that state. So for example, to become certified in our trauma therapy techniques, you have to get educated in a number of things, but one of the things we specifically ask them to be educated in is around spiritual emergency. Because when someone all of a sudden gets into has a peak experience or ends up in a peak state, and like you had said, is not well educated around what's actually happening, they can think they're going crazy. They can feel like this is a psychotic episode. So it's really important for our therapists to be educated around this, so that if someone does end up in a peak experience or a peak state that they weren't planning on, that we're able to educate them around, this is actually okay, this is normal, here's what's happening, and here's how to start to integrate that new peak experience and peak state. So I remember when I was reading books and websites around spiritual emergency, there was a story around a guy who, people kind of conceptually get this idea of being connected to all living things, right? But very rarely do people truly have it as a lived experience. And I don't know what happened, but all of a sudden this guy has now got it as a lived experience. And the way that he kind of celebrated this was threw off all his clothes and was kind of running down the street naked, right? And so someone sees someone like that and they think this guy's having a psychotic episode, whereas in fact he was just having a spiritual emergency. He just so much elation from this new peak experience, they didn't quite know how to express it. And so fortunately, he actually did get some good care. Someone did recognize that it was a spiritual emergency, not a psychotic break. That he got good care and was able to then integrate that experience.
So I'm listening and thinking like Buddha perhaps could make it easier. So,
but a lot of these practices that people did in the past, we're always standing on the shoulders of giants, right? If they hadn't have done those practices that are, took them years and years to actually do to experience some of these things, we probably wouldn't have been looking for quicker and quicker ways to actually get those states. Yeah, well, so I guess the thing that's about this particular model is that it really isn't like anything else. Like a lot of research is kind of confirming what past people have actually done, or incrementally improving on what people have done in the past. What Grant and his research done is truly breakthrough research, like things that people have never done before, and that he wasn't expecting to be the case. He didn't know that prenatal trauma was going to be the thing that was blocking peak states. So that he didn't have that as a hypothesis. He just kind of followed the symptoms as to where it kind of led him to. he definitely was not expecting it was going to be a biology-based model. But because he was doing lots of regressions, one of the prenatal regressions he did was the moment that the primary cell is actually established. So, soon after conception, so after the fourth cell division is when this one primary cell is. So it was just kind of continually asking questions that I guess others weren't asking, and creating, truly new breakthrough. So no one was actually. I guess there might have been some kind of prenatal psychology around. So there was a little bit around that, but to go all the way back to when your parents were being implanted in your grandmother, like, people were not saying that our consciousness was going back further than that. You might have had in the womb trauma, and maybe a couple of people might have been willing to consider the egg and sperm were having trauma, but the people were not going all the way back to that. Part of our description of what consciousness is, so in our model, you've got both the conscious self and the unconscious self. And the conscious self is the observing self, which has got lots of different names, right? Some people say that's the spirit, or and what we call the directing self, which is basically the genes expressing themselves. That's the biological process that's meant to be happening, which is both things that we consciously choose to do, like when we walk and talk, but also the things that are unconsciously happening, like our heart pumping and lungs breathing, that sort of stuff that we don't need to consciously think about. So that's the directing self. So those two things in our model make up the conscious self. The unconscious self are the different parts of our consciousness that we call the triune brain model. So we have kind of built on Papaz and McLean's triune brain model in understanding the unconscious self. So that uses the mind consciousness, the heart consciousness, and the body consciousness. But we've actually then discovered that there's not only those three, but there's 6 other components that make up that kind of unconscious self as well. And they can play a part in different peak states. They're all meant to be, in an ideal world, they're all meant to be completely integrated and operating as one holistic form of consciousness. But almost no one has that. Everyone's got them kind of just partly playing together, but actually all on their own kind of way. So it's kind of like this dysfunctional family that's happening internally, where we have this inner conflict of a part of me wants to do this and a part of me doesn't. And that's because of the different components of this unconscious self are not fully integrated. Whereas, for example, to achieve inner peace, we need to have our mind consciousness and our heart consciousness fully integrated, so that we're able to think while we're feeling and feel while we're thinking. Whereas some people who struggle with actually healing trauma is because they have a traumatic experience, that an upset emotion, then they switch to their mind consciousness to try and analyze what happened, and they don't feel the emotion anymore, because their mind and heart consciousness are completely separated. So they can only think and not feel, or they can only feel and not think. They can't do both at the same time, whereas optimally we should be able to do both at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it still reminds me so much of this yoga actually tradition, because actually what it's about integration of all our parts actually.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Maybe again, as you told, like in ancient times they felt it somehow, but they tried it to explain, and thanks to it you got this model also. Do you have to pass through therapy to experience these states? Is it like obligatory, some work you have to do with someone, or still people can make some steps by themselves to to approach these states? What do you think?
Well, certainly the first thing I would recommend is the way that we know for sure the quickest way to get there is to identify a certified peak states therapist, which they can find on our website, peakstatestherapy.com. because they're trained in this model, and so it's a way that we have, methodically, got people into peak states on an ongoing basis, repeatable results. And one of the things that's very unique about our work, and this is one of the things where Grant is very ethical, is both the trauma therapy work and the peak state therapy work that we do on what we call pay for results. So we agree up front, what does success look like? So for example, with the peak states, I'm going to feel this particular way, or the voices are going to disappear, whatever the outcome measure is, and our clients only pay for the therapy work if we achieve that outcome. Now, can you achieve this sort of? Now, you definitely can. It's just going to be kind of trial and error, right? So, firstly, if you understand what kind of traumas might be blocking you, then any effective trauma healing technique will work. But you kind of need to understand the model, and so we say with the training that we give our therapists that it's not actually the techniques that's the most important thing. In fact, we're always trying to improve our techniques to make them easier to do, make them quicker. It's actually the model that our therapists are learning that's actually the most important part of their training, because not only does it help them become better therapists on what we're trying to achieve, it also helps explain, like you were saying, a lot of things I'm sharing with you, saying, oh yeah, that sounds like yoga, or this sounds like this practice. And it's true. What it's doing is it's giving you a model to help you better understand what other people are saying in other fields, whether that's spiritual, shamanic, yoga practices.
So is it true that the therapist itself and like his field is also like influencing, or like
No. The way our therapists are working is they have a model and they're guiding the person to heal themselves. They're not actually interacting or influencing the person at all, which I actually really like, because that's very empowering. It's kind of giving away some responsibility. If some people say, I can, do this remote stuff with you and this sort of stuff, and that kind of you're giving away some power in actually doing that. And I'm sure some people actually have the ability to do that. But I like this approach that kind of empowers the client themselves, that they're the ones that did the healing. We just had the model and the map of kind of where to take them.
So you just like give this model and space for the person to heal himself. Physical illnesses that you deal with.
Yeah, so we do have some physical stuff that we work with as well. So our trauma healing model can definitely help with chronic pains. And the last few years, our research has been very much on how do we eliminate diseases. So we've had some good results with, say, Lyme disease, and we hope to be doing continually refining that process to make it more effective. We've had some good success with traumatic brain injuries, but the work with the research team has been doing in the last couple of years, we think this model that we've got is actually going to allow us to develop a treatment for pretty much any disease. So, we've got on our list type 1 diabetes, Parkinson's disease, HIV. We think it's possible to develop treatment.
And what do you think about this? For example, now it's again like trendy. People go to make ayahuasca. They took psychedelics, mushrooms, and everything. That people actually see the things. So
yes.
Might be, I don't know. So this is something similar. Is it somehow, to your experience, is it somehow also kind of healing, or maybe it's some way that, on the contrary, takes people away from healing?
So it doesn't necessarily heal. What it actually does is it's giving you insight. It's giving you perception of what's happening in the primary cell. So you might see, either have really pleasant experiences, which could be, your consciousness is in a part of your cell that's actually operating really well, or you might see quite frightening things. People say they see, big spiders and, all sorts of stuff that's actually, stuff that looks demonic and this sort of thing. So that's a reflection of what's happening in the primary cell. So it can give you a perception ability, but unless you then have good healing techniques to heal that experience, or you have a good model as to what's actually happening to work out how to integrate or eliminate that from your primary cell, then it actually can end up in a spiritual emergency or something negative. So I wouldn't say that it's healing, but it does give you some heightened perception of what's happening.
Do you get these perceptions in your model? I mean, like, do you see like the things in your primary cell, like some, or you got feeling of it, or how it's?
Yeah, so we've tried to make the model so that most people are going to be able to do the healing work that's required. So some people do naturally have the visual perception of what's happening in the primary cell, but you don't actually need to have that perception ability to be effective at using this model.
Mm-hmm.
The key thing you need to be able to do is to just have your awareness in your body and identify what's the emotions or physical sensations that you're feeling. So just about everyone can do that. Not everyone, but the vast majority of people are able to do that. And you just need to be able to do that and use an effective trauma healing technique to release those stuck emotions or physical sensations from the body, from the primary cell.
Mm-hmm. So,
but for people who have been having visual perceptions and not understanding what's going on, this then gives them a model to understand that, which, as you said before, when people have a peak experience and they don't have a model, they don't have education around how to understand that. Once someone's educating you correctly around what's happening, you kind of relax a little bit and can start to integrate that, what's actually happening.
some people experience it naturally. Some people get through, for example, some therapy and have some glimpse of it, or maybe for some even longer periods. So how to integrate it, like in life, or how to?
Well, it depends. It depends on how you experienced it and what it is you're experiencing. So for some people, they get a new peak state and they're just, this is awesome, this is great, and there's no integration required. For other people, they're actually still functional, but it's like in the background, there's a part of me that's kind of resisting this a bit. And so we have some trauma healing techniques for that, because what's effectively happened is, some of these unconscious traumas that are saying it's not safe to have these new peak states are getting activated. When people have a spiritual emergency because they just don't understand what's actually happening, education, kind of just letting them know, you're not having a psychotic episode. This is a spiritual emergency. You're experiencing a peak state. It's actually, when you integrate this, it's actually going to be a really positive thing, as well as kind of some grounding work, like being with the earth or eating kind of grounded type of food and this sort of stuff can actually be a way to help with integration. Now, interestingly, things like meditation or spiritual practices quite often is what puts people into a spiritual emergency. If that's the case, you should actually stop the meditation or spiritual practice until you've actually integrated it. Whereas many meditators or spiritual practitioners would actually say, continue to do it to actually get through that. But in fact, if it's the thing that triggered it, you should actually stop it until you've integrated it, would be our advice.
So it's like a signal of the body that you need time to process it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How long does it take this therapy for? Because to eliminate all the traumas, I can imagine. Like I think, for me, like psychologist, it's endless process. Like you can find this trauma, even if you find the initial, but there can be so many of them. Yeah. So
it depends on what you're talking about trying to achieve. So for one particular peak state, it's probably about 5 to 10 hours. So there's always at least 3 sessions that we do with any of our clients, because even if they got the peak state after the first session, we always do a couple of follow-up sessions because we want to make sure that it's fully integrated, that it's actually permanent, the work that we've done with them. So there's always at least 3 sessions. The sessions could be up to a couple of hours. So yeah, it's probably about 5 to 10 hours work per peak state to get people into that.
And it really holds, like, do you have some kind of, like after 1 year or 2 years, it's not vanishing, this feeling?
Yeah. So Silent Mind and Inner Peace, we've been doing those processes for over a decade.
Mm.
And because we had pay for results, people would be coming back asking for a refund if it wasn't permanent.
Okay. And isn't it working like this, again, like from a psychological perspective? I know that one trauma is connected to another, you heal one, but another can hold you still back, because there is so many interconnections. And you
That is true.
heal something, but at the same time, another pulls you back. Can it be like this?
It definitely can be like this. Like, we literally have thousands of traumas. So it is. It does feel like it's a lifetime work to just continually be working on healing our traumas. And it's not necessarily that they're connected. It's just that once we've healed one lot of traumas, we've now integrated that, the body's going, oh, this is working. Here's the next thing to work on.
I still have something for you. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so what fascinates you personally in this topic, in this research, in this work? I don't know. What are your personal fascinations about this topic?
Well, like I said at the start, I wanted to be able to figure out how to get everyone into states that has them experiencing life positively. And the thing that got Grant on this path was him having this state of beauty way that he had for nearly 30 years and then lost it, and then figuring out how to get that back. Now, the amazing thing is, 30 years later, he still has not worked out how to get beauty way back. But it's that journey to try and figure out how to get it back that's actually made all of these amazing discoveries. Now, for the first time, we feel like we are right on the edge. And we think it's as possible as before the year is out, we might actually have a process for beauty way. Now, it'll be a research protocol at that stage, so we'll still need to do some testing before it's ready for the public. But within the next year or so, we could have a public process that people could get into beauty way. I'm fascinated by that because I guess, one, it's been one of the key kind of visions we've had for the organization, but just to imagine how different humanity will be if we could get everyone into this kind of a state. Like, we are destroying the planet, we're in wars, and like there's so much dysfunction going on in humanity. And so I have this vision of, getting humanity into this place where that we're in harmony, we're looking after the planet, we're sustainable. So, and so that's one of the big reasons why I'm really fascinated around peak states, because I think we can come up with strategies and use our mind to try and figure out this stuff. But I think unless we change our way of being, our state of consciousness, then I don't think we're actually going to get humanity where it needs to be.
Yeah, sounds things that worth, trying and worth living for.
Yeah.
And about the books that published by your institute, can a person apply these techniques by himself, or it's not? He can just learn about them.
No. There's a legal agreement at the start of the book saying you're taking personal responsibility for your health and that sort of stuff. But so we've got our prenatal regression technique, the Wholehearted Healing Manual, which teaches you how to do that. And one of our former colleagues wrote the Wholehearted Healing Workbook. So they are 2 books around the prenatal regression technique. Subcellular Psychobiology is the book that we use as our textbook for trauma healing. Mm-hmm. Now, not all of the techniques are in there, but most of them are. Now, you can read that book and kind of get a cognitive understanding of it, but people have read that book and then come and do the training, and then obviously doing the training and hearing about it and seeing a demonstration and practicing it, you just get it at a whole different level. But it is possible to use some of the techniques from that book. So Grant's father had schizophrenia, and this is how he worked out how to get rid of mind chatter from everyone, because it's the same biological issue that causes schizophrenia that has us have mind chatter. It's just that there's the inability to suppress those thoughts when you get to schizophrenia. So Grant wrote a book called Silence the Voices, which was this is probably the easiest book to read. It's a little bit more like a novel, mystery novel, around talking about both his research path to discover the techniques, but also the personal path of trying to help his father, who he did eliminate schizophrenic voices from. And there are a couple of techniques in there, specifically how to eliminate the voices one at a time is in that book, as well as explaining other types of voices that we might have.
And I'm very grateful for the talk. I think it's very important to just talk more about this. I'm interested more.
Yep. No, so feel free to follow up again later, and all the best with the research that you're doing. I think this is a great thing to get out into the world.